Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my two guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Good to be with you again, Arnie.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. How's the weather?
For me, it's hot. But for you, it would be moderately hot, I guess. It's been around 31 degrees for the last couple of days, but quite humid too.
Yeah, yeah.
So it
I
makes
sm
it uncomfortable.
I smile at this because I start getting cold when it's about say 15 degrees centigrade above zero, and of course you've got minus 50s and minus 60s on
Uh,
on a
you're
vortex
going,
chill sort of thing, you know.
you're going to have to visit Canada in the winter someday.
It's absolutely
A
incredible.
different experience.
The
Yeah.
variability across the planet and how people do get accustomed to it. Welcome, Wally Klinck.
And how the self-appointed experts point to the most extreme cases at any time to bolster their argument. I think I heard it was going to be 37 here today.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
pretty hot for here.
it is. That's just on the century. I think 36.8 is the 100, the old 100 on the Fahrenheit. So, yeah, that's quite hot. Don't say it's not. And if you're not accustomed to it, of course, it's going to knock you around. The key to heat, the key is to keep the fluids up. Always be sipping water. And I did it. I worked in the desert for long enough to know it. And you've always got to check the colour of your urine, because if it starts to get a darker colour, you are lacking fluids. So you always keep an eye on the colour of your urine, and keep the fluids up. And if you're not urinating, then you can be in strife. Heat stress, heat stroke can kill you, and that's why you've got to keep the fluids. Let the body actually do its own controlling. You may not be happy, but you'll be alive. Just keep those fluids. In the desert, it's nothing for someone to take, honestly, just for a short trip, 10 litres. 10 litres of water for a short trip, and if they're on a long trip, they may even have a couple of jerry cans full of water. Just if they get
Well,
caught, water is what keeps you alive. It's not. You don't need food. You can fast for a while. It won't knock you around. But water, you can die in hours if you
I
can't.
think
Yeah.
about 3 days is the limit, isn't it, without water?
Yeah, I can't answer that. I'm not a thing. It depends on the temperature and the stress and what you're going
That
through.
would add to it, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. But as long as you've got water, then your life is extended until something else happens. So always think of that. Keep water up, and that's why heat's very. I'm
Yeah.
mindful of it. 47, yeah, weeks of 47 we were getting in the desert. So that is brutal. It's cruel. But you can work it through, providing you keep up the water. So for all those who are experiencing the heat around the world, that's how I learnt to manage it, on good advice from our flying doctors in the desert, who, yes, dealt with heat stress and heat stroke, where fatalities occurred because of heat. So very important. All right, let's cut across to our websites. And let's have a look at what's going on. In Australia, at the moment, we've got one person in intensive care with COVID, identified as COVID. One person, there's a country of 20-something million, I think 26 million people. One person is in intensive care. 12 million are now in a state of lockdown. 12 million people are in a state of lockdown with one person in intensive care. These are the facts. This is the government website. This is the 27th of June. Which is only a couple of days ago. It's the 30th of June here. So that's the state of play. These are the most recent statistics. I've gone to their website to get them. It's presented here, very, very important that you start using your faculties and start thinking about here. And that is that vaccine is the only solution. And the question is, what is the problem? What is the problem? We've got one person in intensive care. What is the problem? But vaccine, face masks and lockdown are the answer. But what is the problem? The problem is that people are getting the flu. Well, they get the flu every year. We really need to start thinking, and this is something that we're not doing. And there's a reason why that is happening. One is that Australian media is totally dominated by two groups. One has about 75%, the Murdoch group, and the Nine Entertainment has about 25%, roughly, of the media control in Australia. So we've got two groups dominating the narrative, and we don't actually hear from any alternative sources except small players like us. And that's why it's important to inject different thoughts into the equation. And that's why it's so important that you have diversity. Now, in Tasmania, state of Australia, to the south of Australia, southeast, that's that island state, the Labor leader, he's the opposition leader, is shown with a photo here of you don't become a good communist by going to meetings or memorising the manifesto. You do it with your fists. In other words, it's violence. Bringing about communism is an act of violence. He's the leader of the opposition in Tasmania. Now, his chief of staff also happens to be an ex-communist, Graham McCulloch, and this is in the Australian newspaper. There's the headings on the 30th of June today. So we've got communists in our administration, and you think, oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. I mean, why would we let communists go into our administration? And I'm thinking, hang on, you haven't been reading the papers. Because if you were reading the papers, you'd know, this is dated in 2019, that our former Prime Minister Bob Hawke, was actually working for a foreign power. And he was actually, this is when he was president of the Australian Commercial Trade Unions, he was actually involved heavily in forwarding information directly onto a foreign power. Excuse me. In here, the WikiLeaks, this is in 2013, WikiLeaks revealed that he was actually directing regular communications through to foreign powers. WikiLeaks did it. So you've got it here, 2019. This is actually he was a good bloke, and, well, you can't really blame him for doing it article. This one was, well, did you know article? Did you know that he was actually doing this while he was there? And then just this weekend past, a young bloke, I assume it's a young bloke, Cameron Coventry, at the University of Ballarat, is actually looking into these telegrams and other means of communication that this former Prime Minister was sending to a foreign power while he was in a position of significant influence. Head of the ACTU, Commercial Trade Unions, he was the head of it. There he was. Now, this is Russia Today on the 28th, so only a couple of days back. And of course, it's referring to these articles as Australia's slavish service to the United States intelligence. But I would put it to you that it's not necessarily the United States intelligence only that he was directing this information to, because he had political loyalties and he was an honorary citizen of another nation. So you need to do your homework and find out about who this man was, what he was doing, because we are being subverted by people who do not love our country. They do not love our nation. They're actually attempting to bring about a communist world dictatorship. Now, these two blokes here, this is Kevin Barlow and Brian Chambers, 1986. They were hung for attempting to import drugs into Australia. The Malaysian government hung them. The last Australian to be hung was Ronald Ryan. He in his escape from Pentridge Prison, he shot a prison guard. The prison guard died. He was charged with a murder, and as a consequence, he was hung. I believe that Peter Walker did about 20-something years in prison before he was finally released. But this bloke, Ronald Ryan. Now, in the course of all of this, our consideration, we've got to look and say, okay, how horrific it is for the state to actually execute someone. How horrific it is. And it is horrific when you think that the state has the authority and the power. But I believe that we're actually blindsided psychologically into accepting other forms of death by the state, of which we're not even thinking clearly about. Vaccines and things like that, the pandemic chaos, they're blaming the Prime Minister. They want more federal intervention. That's a very interesting philosophical point here. We've just got to consider that. It's really, really important. The increased levels of taxation debt have increased 78%. 78%. People are having trouble paying their taxes. Really, really important to recognise that. I'm gonna come back to us here because I think we've got enough in there for us to make a meaningful start. Currently, we've got a situation where we're under the cloud of a climate crisis. A climate crisis. Second, we're under the cloud of a COVID, an epidemic crisis. And the third crisis, which is also emerging, is finance. It's one of a financial crisis. This is emerging. I've been warning about that through the journals for months and months and months, that the emasculation, the capitulation or collapse of our middle class is deliberate. That's what the lockdown is there to achieve, is to stop the cash flow so that the viability of the middle class will be circumvented and they will collapse. And of course it's the middle class who actually do most of the heavy lifting in any economy. And you've got to consider that the assets, if you like, of the whole world are going into the hands of these mega corporations, while the middle class is being deliberately collapsed under a climate crisis, a COVID crisis, and what is now emerging as a financial crisis. We've really, really got to consider this three areas of attack that are against us, because it's this isn't kid stuff. This is very serious. It's a formidable challenge to our way of life and to how we think, or how we're actually going to work this through. And to me, our faculties are the most important thing. Clarity of thinking is the most important thing in the current scenario. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, the former chief of staff of Barack Obama, Emmanuel Rahm, made the candid statement, never let a crisis go to waste. So you're talking about crises there, three great challenges that we're facing, and they're not small scale, they're not national or crises. They're all on a world, all on a world scale. So people who desire to achieve political ends have a tendency to like crises, because a crisis enables them to enact policies that allow them to achieve their ends. It puts the population in a situation where they have to accommodate the programs of the political forces, because they are intimidated by the threats that are being imposed upon them. So when a big crisis like this arises, your hackles should go up, and you should automatically suspect that it might not be something that is inherent in the nature of things. It might actually be an invented crisis, a concoction. And I think that this has been proven to be the case with the climate crisis. There's so much evidence that certainly climate varies, and because it varies, you can always make it look as if it's more critical or worse than it is. And this has been done. There was a huge scandal, the International Climate Control, whatever that was, an academic organization years ago, and it turned out that they were fudging and falsifying the statistics on temperatures in order to support their thesis that we were going into some terrible climatic crisis. And then we had, of course, a 16-year-old, she was Swedish, right? Greta Thunberg. She became the world's expert on climate change. And I think she addressed the United Nations. She addressed everybody you could possibly imagine. She had nothing to say from a technical standpoint, but she was very, very emotional. And because she looked a lot younger than her actual years, she tended to generate sympathy for her point of view. So, and then this COVID thing, there's so much, variability. They've changed their line so many times. Every week you've got a new set of regulations that you have to follow, and they're contradictory of other regulations. And obviously, it's just designed to put everybody into a chronic state of insecurity and not knowing what's going on and what is expected of them. But I think it's wearing out a bit now, because they promised that if people got vaccinated, then they could go back to normal life. And they're not keeping their promise. In fact, I understand that in Israel, 50% of new cases of so-called COVID, now they've got this Delta variety that's supposed to be attacking us from India, and this is the one that is becoming predominant in Israel, and 50% of new cases of COVID are in people who have been double vaccinated against it. So when information like this comes out, you realize that we've been just given a pack of false promises, and that, it's another crisis, and it's enabled people with political and economic ambitions to upset the entire world economy and to dispossess the middle class of the world. And it's such a devious and diabolical thing, because they've taken the lives and futures away from so many people. And they keep saying that we'll be getting back to normal, at the same time as they're saying we won't be going back to anything known as normality. We're going into a new normal. And so, again, it's chronic, constant cognitive dissonance. You can't make any sense of this. So not only is it brutally cruel to people who are losing their property, but it's also cruel in the sense that it is disrupting their ability to think.
Yeah.
And this is it's been a communist program forever. These communism paid a lot of attention back in after the Soviet Union was established. They paid a lot of attention to psychology, and the way they governed that country was through psychological manipulation and intimidation. And it's exactly what we're seeing today.
Yeah.
These are communist tactics. And people, people say, gee, they're doing silly things. They're not silly. They're calculated. And they're having a tremendous effect and succeeding in ways that it would have been hard to imagine a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or 18 months ago, anyway.
Exactly right. And I just want to, before I give you the floor, Wally, I just want to bring up Beverly Eekman and her work. I've got two of her books on my desk for reading. Cloning of the American Mind is the one that I'm actually going to go through. Most important, her work, because she's actually indicated, she's actually explained in her work how group think, how people are manipulated, not only through the classroom, but also through any sort of medium that actually causes you to think as a group. Now, the argument for vaccines is herd immunity. Well, do you need a vaccine to achieve herd immunity? You actually don't. But the argument is saying that. And the thing is that you're not actually using any scientific approach. No one's using a scientific approach on this pursuit of vaccines, face masks, lockdowns, vaccine passports, constant monitoring, state surveillance. No one's using a scientific approach on this. It isn't justified scientifically. It's actually used another method, and that method we'll look and we'll explore further on during the course of this presentation. Your thoughts, please, Wally Klinck.
Yes, Arnie, there's no doubt about it. The whole thing is basically political. It's political because of the manner in which it is used to fundamentally change our attitudes and our long-held institutions, which we've developed as a cultural part of the cultural heritage, and which has given the West an element of stability and predictability that has allowed us to build our civilization in spite of the interruptions through major wars and things like that. We've come out with the ability to move on and to keep building. And so it is definitely political. As Douglas said, that things do not happen just automatically. Policy is, or what we have is crystallized policy. In other words, it stems from a consciousness on the part of some element of the society, and it's not an accident. We have used our faculties to advance ourselves over the decades and centuries, and it hasn't just been a big stumbling act. The human mind, the human consciousness, human awareness, and the ability to think, to apply certain principles and so on have been major factors involved. And unfortunately, there is an element of our society that is very, very oriented toward Puritanism, punishing behavior, the desire for power. Some people think that if they could just have power over others, they could set things all right. Or other than that, they don't care about setting things right. They just want power for power, the sake of power, and the sake of wealth. But you see people like that, and this goes for the victims too. I think they have no source of strength other than their own very limited mental powers. It doesn't, and these powers are not adequate in themselves to bring about a beneficial state of society. As a matter of fact, when you leave our solutions to people who are seeking power, you're looking for trouble, because they're not the type of people who are going to make life easier, more pleasant, and better for people at all. The people who are driven by ego and the desire to acquire, and it's not a reliable source of inspiration at all. I mean, if people would just consider for a moment, the human race started out rather small, and it has developed into a very significant population. And that is in spite of all of the crises that are supposed to be afflicting us, according to the people who are spreading these ideas, and worse, proposing measures, very damaging measures, to try and allegedly stop the effects of these supposed crises. It's, as they say, never let a good opportunity pass by. And they don't. They're always looking for an excuse to dominate others, to lord it over others, to defraud others of their wealth, their sustenance, their security, and even, through, as Bob said, using psychology as a strong element in their war against civilization. And so that's the way it works. And unfortunately, people are very, very fundamentally they must be very insecure because they fall for this type of these maneuvers, these fraudulent claims, all too easily. And that drives them into, to acceding to policies which are not realistic, certainly not beneficial, and fraudulent policies which should never gain support by the general public because it is only doing them harm by listening to alarmists who are using the alleged crises to steal from us our freedom and our wealth. As we can see now, so much of our wealth has been taken over by, they say that approximately 50% of the middle class has been heavily denuded, or their assets have been stolen. And it's mainly because they allow themselves to be the victims of psychological warfare. And that's a tremendously sad thing, because there should be no victimizing the general population by lies and false predictions. So we were really, as you said, Bob, the communist strategy has been highly directed toward psychological warfare. People, as long as that can be hidden, and every method is made to hide it, then it's going to be difficult to get people to calm down and perceive things as they really are, rather than as it's being alleged they are. So somehow or another, it is without knowledge. A nation without knowledge perishes, and that is just exactly what happens, because people are pushed around, and they're misled, and they agree to policies out of fear that are only doing them more harm than the alleged harm could ever do or would ever do. So largely it's psychological, and I think we have to base our defense on a psychological level, because that is our weak point. If we weren't so easily fooled and misled astray, the power-seeking elements in our society would never be able to achieve the evil ends that they are working against civilization.
Thank you for that, Wally. I've just been jumping around the internet looking for a link to Beverly Eakman's book called Pushback, and I will find it, and I'll show it to you, because it is very important. How do you actually empower yourself, and what sort of tools? Now, just to touch on that before I give you the floor, Robert, I read a book on the Chinese communist indoctrination in the Korean prisoner of war camps with the Americans, and how so many Americans came out of that scarred, deeply scarred, loathing their culture and losing their love for their nation. And it was actually a weapon that was used and tested out in those prisoners, on those prisoners in that prisoner of war camp, and it was so very effective. And of course it's within the group that these things are achieved. It's within the group, not with the individual, because the individual can reason, but in the group they actually go along with the what's actually being talked about and discussed, and there's actually ownership, and there's if you like, ownership of the end result. And so group manipulation is actually a critical tool used against you, and it's something that we need to actually look more deeply at in the future. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, that psychological assault on the prisoners of war in the Korean War was, I think, largely directed by agents from Russia, from the Soviet Union, and they had been concentrating on psychology for many years since they seized power in 1917. There was Pavlov and the Pavlovian dogs, and they applied those techniques to humans, and they reduced people to slavering, I guess, when certain facts or information were presented to them, and they had quite astonishing success with that. It's a success that is equivalent, I would say, to the success that the COVID fearmongers have achieved in getting the vast majority of the population to go along with social distancing. That's a strange term, isn't it? Should be anti-social distancing, obviously, and mask wearing and constant hand washing, and just all these things. And people have become convinced that by going along with all this, they are fulfilling a responsible role as members of society. And this is a very dangerous thing, because if you're not enthusiastic about all this, well, you're going to be subject to harassment by the people who think that you are a danger to society. And we've seen this in a number of cases, and particularly now with the snitching on neighbors. Snitching has never been regarded as a particularly admirable activity in our society, but in a communist society, it is, and as it was in the Nazi regime, because there was a small group of people in power, and they wanted to retain that power by having an element of society inform on everybody else. It was perfected, I think, by the Stasi in East Germany. They were really good. I'm not sure how many. It was a small percentage, really, of the population. Not 1% or anything, but maybe 10% of people who were enlisted into this program of monitoring, spying on their neighbors. And it was very effective. So we shouldn't assume that this is practiced only in overtly communist nations, because there is a body in the British government that is behavioral. Anyway, it concentrates on behavioral science. It's been around now for a couple of decades, I think. And they boasted, this is an agency of the British government, they boasted that through psychology, they could change the public's perception, I think, of virtually anything. And they said that they could do it in such a way that the public would never be aware of the way in which they were being manipulated. Well, this is occurring in a purportedly democratic society. And it is a cynical expression of a plan to make that society conform to the wishes of a small oligarchy. So these psychological maneuvers and manipulations and subversion is going on, I think, in all societies now. And in fact, maybe it has for a very long time. I think that war propaganda in major wars has been an element of this. It's been psychological manipulation in order to get populations to go along with programs that if they weren't under that influence, they might have had second thoughts about. So it's an old device. It's an old strategy, and we're just seeing a really large scale and brutal application of it at the present time. There was professional association, medical professional associations in Canada are terrorizing doctors. The association in the province of Ontario issued a statement, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago, that said no doctor can dissent from the dictates of the public health authorities on the methods of dealing with this COVID crisis. So you can't question anything about it. You have to just go along with the whatever the association is deciding, and the association is getting its directives from who knows where. But there was a textbook case of how this is applied in a communist format in Canada this week. It was a doctor in the province of Saskatchewan, a doctor named Dr. Christian. I forget his first name, but he was summoned into a meeting of his superiors and I think some academics to be informed that he was losing his job because he had said that there should be perhaps some hesitation about vaccinating children, and in any case, that before such a program is undertaken, there should be a very rigorous consent process, and it should involve the parents. We have a situation now in Canada where the governments are virtually seducing kids to get vaccinations. They give them ice cream cones and donuts, and they tell them, if you do this, then if you get your vaccination, you'll get this small reward. It is just really diabolical. It's obscene, unbelievable that this is going on. Anyway, this poor Dr. Christian, I shouldn't say he's poor because he's obviously a very strong man, and he was quite defiant. They told him he was being relieved of all his responsibilities and duties, and he would be, I think, permanently fired in September or something like that. But these people, they were so pretending to be so nice about it. They said, "Doctor, you have options. We will tell you about your options." Here they're slitting his throat professionally, but they're doing it in such a gentle manner that means that they don't have to bear the burden of guilt for their brutal treatment of this man. Now, he was very good. And he said, "Are you aware that on Monday of this week, the World Health Organization recommended that children should not be vaccinated at present?" And one of the women on the panel said, "That's not true." Well, unfortunately, it is true. But that won't stop these people from firing this doctor. Nothing reasonable can be used as a defense against them. They are determined to achieve an objective, and they will use any deception or any lie in order to get the result they want. Now, there's pressure on them, obviously, too, but it's such a dreadfully sleazy performance they're putting on. Anyway, the doctor responded. They kept trying to convince the doctor that he was very upset and that he was being hurt emotionally. And he said, "No, don't think that. I'm not upset at all. And you people are going to pay for this one day in a big way." He was not intimidated by this process at all. But it reminds me of a book written by C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength. And there was an organization that was, in the way these organizations are taking over our society, was planning to take over British society. And its acronym, I forget exactly what the acronym stood for, but it was NICE, NICE. And everything they were doing to strip power away from the population and create these dreadful monopolies was under the rubric of NICE. And that's exactly the kind of impression that this disgusting panel gave in summoning this doctor before them and telling him that because he's a public safety officer, Les. And they said because he was trying to protect children, he was going to lose his job. That is the level to which this management of the COVID situation has sunk in Canada. And I certainly hope that people are going to realize that this is utterly unacceptable and that it is the creation of a medical monopoly that, unless we stop it, will be the worst tyranny we've ever seen in this country.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right, Robert. The worst tyranny that any country has ever seen, where they forcibly, by compulsion of being excommunicated, if you like, from society, if you don't accept the medical dictum, this new religion. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, there's no doubt about it that it is a tremendous move towards centralization of power, because people, I think most people are almost primarily concerned about their physical and emotional and mental health. And they can be deprived of those things. And being aware of that, they are easily stampeded or frightened. And they lose their, you lose your ability to think when you're under severe duress or threat. You may, if you're very strong, you may stand up to it. But most people feel defenseless without the assistance of the experts. And so they tend to support the experts. And that's okay if the experts are sound. But when experts start telling you that you must do this or you must think this or that, then there's good reason to hesitate and to question whether or not these experts are faultless. Because they're not, they're mortal human beings. They make mistakes, they can make mistakes, they have made mistakes, and some very big mistakes. And so, you don't want to get taken up with groupthink. You were given a brain of your own, and you should use that brain to individually consider and evaluate things that are posited to you. And if everyone just gave up their ability to rationalize or to think, that would be the end of civilization. Because it takes a certain amount of sound thinking to maintain an organization, a family, a nation, whatever. And if you lose your faculties, you're going to come to a bad end. And that is what this group, you can see the way they do these things. They try and present the evidence as that anyone who doesn't go along with the experts is a menace to the rest of society. Well, sometimes you have to ask the question, you have to question whether or not it's the people who are asking questions about policies or the people who are trying to impose them on society are the real danger.
Yeah, exactly right. Wally, who is the real danger? Is it COVID, or is it actually this whole infrastructure of totalitarianism over us? What is the real danger to society? And the threat of climate, the threat of COVID, and now the threat of, if you like, finance economics coming at us like a steam train. There is no way that the existing levels of debt are sustainable. There is no way, and you've got to actually look at this whole question of is the world, is the climate actually so variable that we can't tolerate it? And I'm of the view that we certainly can tolerate it, and in fact we can adapt to whatever comes at us. It doesn't mean that there's a false argument of abusing the planet. I believe we've got a responsibility for husbandry, but not for totalitarianism. We are created unique and free, and that's a gift from God, and we don't relinquish that at any time unless it's absolutely and totally vital just for that one event. If it's building a bridge, then we come together. We actually give up some freedom to build the bridge, but and then we go back to our lives once the bridge is built, and that's fine. That makes sense. But what's happening at the moment is locking down the whole world for others to master over us, and the imposition as the only answer, the only viable answer, as a world government, this world government, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, as if it has the only answer to your vitality and your health, is to administer some mRNA altering injection that's actually going to alter your system. Is that the only answer to maintain vitality and immune health? And of course that's absurd to even consider, but this is the only narrative that we're hearing, and we are losing our faculties. We're not actually thinking. And then, of course, probably the greatest fraud ever perpetuated over man, and that is the existing financial system, where central banks can create numbers out of nothing, and that's all they do is create numbers out of nothing, and yet the whole world is mortgaged against those numbers. These aren't easy things to think about. But that's what your faculty is about. That's what this life is about, facing the problems of your day in your situation. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, people want to find a way out of their predicament. A lot of them seem to be convinced that following the orders of the established governmental powers is the way out. I think they're going to be very disappointed. They're going to find that all the promises that have been made were never intended to be kept, because they've got the world by the throat and they're not going to let it go. They're going to play it like a fish on the end of a line. They will let you go out a little bit and then they'll draw you back. But always you'll be getting closer to the fellow who wants to have you for dinner. And so there are people who think that that's the solution, and you look for allies who are thinking otherwise in society. And I think Christians have a tendency to look to fellow Christians for this solution to the problems we're in. But I get so upset with Christians who come up with sort of airy-fairy, impractical advice. I was listening today to two different groups like this, and they both say the solution is for everybody to repent. Well, I think everybody should be examining their consciences all the time. But what does this mean? We have to repent, and repenting somehow magically will get us out of this mess we're in. I don't believe that, and I don't think that Jesus gave us the message that we were just supposed to sit around repenting in our minds. Christianity is a religion of action. And people who are suggesting that the solution is inaction, I think are dangerous. I don't think they are allies that we can depend upon, because they have no practical advice. As you said, Arnie, the financial system is rotten at the core. It's an absolutely corrupt and corrupting system. Everything it touches, it perverts. It's destroyed the whole character of humanity with this insistence on work, work, work for your salvation. It's a monstrosity. And it is behind all the problems we have, including this COVID crisis, including the climate change crisis, these phony crises that are created. The academics are paid bribes, in effect. They get grants and large salaries in order to deliver the message that is emanating from the financial power. And the financial power is manipulating it all in order to enhance their control over everything. This has always been their goal. And they're facing a constant problem because they're running a defective and racket, and it's always liable to exposure. And if the population in general were aware of this, it would be very, very difficult to manage them as they've done so well through the years. So what we need is not some sort of abstract repentance. What we need is sound thinking, sound analysis of what is wrong with our world. And what we have is a financial system that has been designed by the very people who profit from it. This is a drastic conflict of interest. It's the fundamental conflict of interest of our societies. And we have to face it, and we have to wrest that power over the creation of money from the financial institutions and make sure that the power is distributed to the population as a whole. This is not a complicated technical problem. It's just a matter of saying that we're not going to have a few individuals deciding what money will be created and who's going to get it. We should have, I think, actually a constitutional provision for the distribution of that financial power to every citizen of the country. It only makes sense. The financial system doesn't exist for the benefit of a few. It should exist for the benefit of all. And social credit was the movement that came up with this particular orientation. There are all sorts of financial or monetary reformers in the world. They just want to hand the power to create money over to government. Well, that would be wonderful, wouldn't it? Haven't all these governmental officials and politicians done such a wonderful job of defending our interests and making sure that they're not involved in any corruption? That system would be worse than what we have now. What we need is an effective distribution of financial power to all citizens. It's the logical and ethical approach to economics.
Excellent summary, Robert. And that power, of course, is a reflection similar to our method of voting. Do we want just the dictator to have all power, or do we distribute power in the form of a vote and representatives? And of course it has been that system of democracy has been subverted. It's been subverted by people as high up as our prime ministers. It's been subverted by public servants, leaders of the opposition. The bureaucracy riddled everywhere with people who would subvert our method of limited constitutional government. Very, very important. And that's why voting is critical. It's not something that you should actually just ignore, but something that you should take very, very seriously. But it's not just the vote on election day. It's also how you influence your representative every other day. What efforts you make to ensure that your will is actually represented in Parliament. This isn't a quick, easy, tick-of-the-box answer. This is actually a responsibility. It's a moral environment. You can't have freedom without an ethical, a moral grounding. You can't have it. You've got to actually bring them together. Freedom and responsibility in a moral environment. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wally Klinck.
Yes, of course. Douglas said that democracy, the weakness of our democracy is that it only has a component of political democracy and does not have the component of economic democracy. If the results that resulted from human interaction simply flowed out to the community, with the ones who earn wages or salaries or dividends being rewarded according to their worth, and the remainder just being distributed to the population. You would have an outflowing of the results of human association, wherein human security would be very greatly enhanced, and people would no longer be operating under constant surveillance and anxiety and worry. You'd have a totally different, and that this is not being starry-eyed. It's just plain good sense. If you're prodding people, causing them to be fearful all the time, well, you're obviously going to get a dysfunctional society, because people are going to be responding to almost anything that comes along as a potential threat instead of a blessing from God, nature, or providence, or whatever you want to say. And it gives you an idea of the amount of debt compared to the amount of buying that is done by earned income has expanded enormously. Homes, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years mortgage. The homes were built and they're finished being paid for when they're finished physically. Then how is it that our financial system suggests that it takes 50 years to build a house? It's ridiculous. On the surface of it, it's just plainly ridiculous. But people have been brainwashed with the Puritan work ethic to the extent that they are taken in by this type of moralizing, which isn't moral at all. It's diabolical. It is a big fraud.
No worries. Thank you for that, Wally. Excellent, excellent summary. It is a big fraud. This is what is actually being perpetuated over us, and it's a form of, if you like, brainwashing. It goes back to ancient times. The word psychology is actually origins are with the word magic. The word magic, and of course the people who exercised magic were the magi. The magi. It was the magi who went to worship our Lord when he was born in Bethlehem in a stable. The magi, the foreign kings, they were there already. And of course that means that it's the skill set for manipulating people psychologically goes back thousands and thousands of years. And it was something that was inherent within, got to be honest here, it was inherent within the religious movements. It was actually within that form that they were able to control, either through fear, whether it's what would you call it, the time hundreds of years ago where they were the trepidation, hell, going to hell for sinning and things like that. I mean, it was an imposition of fear over people instead of one of faith and one of plenty, of one of bounty. And no doubt that same groupthink is being exercised through the if you like, the structured institutions. Doesn't matter what you want to call it, whether it's a school, a university, it's a bureaucracy, or it's a church. These institutions can use groupthink to control you. And that's the very point. That's why the individual and their faculty, their thinking faculty, has to take a step back. If you've ever gone through team building, and I've done plenty of it, and the more I read about groupthink and training in a group environment, the more I realise that team building was a form of indoctrination. And of course it comes out of institutions like Tavistock and the Delphi method and things like that. These were tools developed for facilitators, of which one of the first things that Bob Hawke did when he became Prime Minister was to call a mass gathering of people in that group in order to pave a way forward. And with trained facilitators, of course, that way paved forward is already predetermined. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing today. This has been predetermined. It has been planned. It is being executed in front of our eyes. And we are being controlled by groupthink. And of course the counter to groupthink is individual initiative and faculty consideration. Look at the real world. Use the scientific method of observing what's going on. What is the response to it? What is a realistic response to the flu? What is it? Well, vitamin C, oranges. Why do the oranges grow in the winter? Our citrus trees are laden with answers to it. It's in the natural world. You actually, there it is, garlic, vitamin C, onions, things to stimulate your immune system, fresh air, clean water, these things. It makes sense. But of course the option is no option at all, an mRNA injection that alters you forever. That's no option at all. Thank you so much for today, Robert and Wallace Klinck. It's always good value for us to discuss these difficult subjects in a difficult time.
Thank you, Arnie.
Thanks, Arnie. We'll be looking to see you next time.
No worries. Cheers.